Why is some art so expensive? Compare this Marilyn by Andy Warhol, which sold for $200 million, with this original by Rembrandt, which sold for $20 million. They're both eye-watering numbers, but why would the Warhol sell for 10 times the Rembrandt? The Rembrandt is older, rarer, shows more skill. He's a master of chiaroscuro, the delicate process combining light and dark paint. It creates a psychological depth, can almost feel like thought itself. It is technically difficult to do. In all, Rembrandt creates about 300 paintings in his life, of which about 60 were self-portraits. Warhol uses silk screen printing, which is made by shuffling paint across a stencil. And a silk screen can be mass-produced. He made 19,000 in his life, of which hundreds were Marilyn. And check this, Andy plagiarized the photo. It was a publicity shot taken by Gene Corman, which the Supreme Court later decided was theft. So what's going on? Is it all money laundering? Hi everyone, I'm Richard Williamson. This channel is about art, design, and creativity and how it can make our life better. And today we're going to compare the works of two artists that everyone knows and thinks of as quite different. Their technique is certainly very different, but art is not technique. My mission is elevating art beyond elitist tropes. And I propose that with my 3 N's, we can intelligently discuss any artwork. Those 3 N's are novelty, how original is the work, nuance, how difficult is the work to make, and narrative, what's the story behind it? Using those 3 ideas, let's have a Warhol versus Rembrandt debate and see if we can understand why the Warhol sold for 10 times the Rembrandt. Starting with nuance. How difficult would the work be to make? Well, hands down, Rembrandt wins this one. So to solve this riddle is going to come down to novelty and narrative. And buckle up, because for that, I found some fascinating details in my research for this video. We're going to need some context. After World War II, the factories that had been making guns and planes were refitted to make TVs, dishwashers, and cars. With a nose for profit, the admin of Madison Avenue come up with the catchy slogans to redefine the American dream. That K-ration for marching soldiers gets repackaged as TV dinners. Elsewhere in the 1950s, the Hollywood studio system cranks out movies like a factory line. And in 1955, record players are invented and single vinyl begins to dominate music. Everywhere you look, happiness is for sale and it is mass-produced. We can't overstate the cultural upheaval. Before the 1950s, 97% of Americans had never owned a television, had never eaten a meal that wasn't freshly made. Within a few short years, every part of American life becomes industrial. The societal landscape is shifting, a cultural transformation on the scale of the iPhone and social media. It's in this context that Andy Warhol starts making screen prints as art. Previously, screen prints could only be posters. But Andy thought, as culture is being mass-produced, why not the art? Art is the height of culture, right? It was audacious, it was clever, the novelty was off the charts, and it was incredibly insightful. That's why his first subjects were the Campbell's soup can and the Coca-Cola bottle, manufactured food, and the dollar bill, which was now everywhere after the Great Depression. It's also why Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe were his first portraits. They were manufactured artists. Elvis didn't write his music. He put a white face to black music. It was simple repackaging. And Marilyn Monroe was a character manufactured by Norma Jean Mortensen to embody a synthetic feminine ideal. She'd remind herself to play her part. Norma Jean was heard to say, "Time to be Marilyn," presenting herself as a dumb blonde when she was anything but. Nevertheless, while Marilyn was alive, she was not the icon we think of her now. The biggest female stars before her death were Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, Lucille Ball, Ava Gardner, Doris Day, Debbie Reynolds, Sophia Loren, Jane Mansfield, Audrey Hepburn. In the 1950s, Susan Hayward was nominated for Best Actress 5 times. They were the big stars of her time, while Marilyn was disrespected professionally and culturally. It was likely the seed of her tragic death. In a heartbreakingly insecure quest for attention, Marilyn Monroe was the publicity stunt that Norma Jean knowingly played on herself. Andy Warhol's screen prints salvaged her memory, her place in our culture, created a legacy for her in quite a beautiful way. Or put it this way, without Andy's Marilyns and their impact on the art world, would we have even heard of her? Now that's some narrative, but there are hundreds of Marilyns, so let's look at why this specific piece sells for $200 million. In 1964, Andy makes the red, light blue, orange, turquoise, and sage blue Marilyns. He has 4 of them stacked in his studio, all but the turquoise, when a friend came round with performance artist Dorothy Podber, a notorious prankster, troublemaker. She asks Warhol to shoot the works. He says, sure, fine, thinking she'll take some photos. But she pulls out a gun and literally shoots the canvases. They're later repaired, but they become famous as the shot Marilyns. So this $200 million shot sage blue Marilyn is one of those 4 really, truly rare pieces of art, which gives it a heap of novelty. Zooming out, we also have to talk about Warhol as an artist. He had cultural insights that were decades before his time. More glib philosopher than artist, he predicted we'd all have 15 minutes of fame, which was lampooned at the time, and here we are, watching people get their 15 minutes one at a time. So in our Warhol versus Rembrandt debate, the Marilyn has a profound sense of novelty and narrative. So let's take a look at Rembrandt, and for that, we need some more context. The same decade that Rembrandt van Rijn is born, Amsterdam starts the first ever stock exchange to forge the first ever company owned by shareholders, the Dutch East India Company, which was legally allowed to do anything it wanted on foreign soil. Wage war, execute people, enslave people, anything provided it made huge profits. And it did. So when Rembrandt moves to Amsterdam in 1831, he has 3 things going for him. 1, he's walking into a casino paying all bets. This whole stock exchange idea allows Holland to become fabulously wealthy. They earn more from naval trade than the rest of the world combined for the next 200 years. So all of Rembrandt's potential customers are loaded. 2, he's immensely talented. At a very young age, he's so skillful, he's compared and seen as the successor to Caravaggio, especially by Rembrandt himself. Which brings us to 3, he's boldly ambitious with immense self-belief, almost tragically, like he has a rock star complex, which is maybe a bigger deal in Holland, whose cultural proverbs include Hoge bomen vagen veel wind, which translates to tall trees catch a lot of wind. The Dutch just don't celebrate mavericks, but that's exactly what Rembrandt is. He starts boldly signing his art with just his first name, like Michelangelo or Banksy. He is the story of his art. He marries well above his station. He's shamelessly money-focused. At a time when everyone specialized, he'll paint portraits, groups, landscapes, histories, religious scenes. He creates paintings and etchings and negotiates ruthlessly on every piece. He ignores instructions by patrons. He inserts himself into commissions. Here he is executing Christ. Here he is saving Christ. I mean, this guy had cojones. And despite this, or because of it, Rembrandt becomes the rage of Dutch society, as if his controversial approach were a calling card. It's said at the time, to get him to paint you, you have to beg, and then add money. All the while, he's regularly painting self-portraits, which is curious, as nobody's really done it so often before. In many ways, we see Rembrandt inventing the selfie. Then, from about 1636, and for the next decade, his world begins to fall apart. Just after he takes a huge mortgage on a massive house, he and his beloved wife Saskia lose 3 of 4 children before their first birthday. And then, in 1646, Saskia herself dies. Rembrandt is shattered. For years, he's unable to paint. It's his only period with no self-portraits. Not only grieving, he can't pay his mortgage. He's saddled with debt. He becomes a social pariah, as all of Dutch society seems to celebrate this tall tree catching so much wind. He is dragged through various courts in various ways. He finally returns to the canvas in 1650. But even if his paintings then are selling for like $100,000 in today's money, his massive debts force him to declare bankruptcy and launder his earnings through his son just to survive. But it's this period, when he's lost all the money and reputation that were so important to him for so long, that he produces his best work. Here, his main subject looks on a bust of Homer, who died in poverty and he viewed as an inspiration to persevere through difficult times. In the deeper complexity of these pieces, he pioneers Impressionism 200 years before it becomes fashionable. And when people say his loose brushstrokes are down to his age and he's losing his touch, he paints self-portrait with two circles, a technically demanding treatment, which some say is Rembrandt inventing Cubism as well, but most agree it's him biting his thumb at his critics to say, "Screw you, I've still got it." Yet he dies in obscurity, is buried in a rented grave that is now lost to time. All of which gives his work some striking novelty, some extraordinary narrative. But where does that leave us in this Warhol versus Rembrandt debate? Before I summarize, I've got to admit that during my research for this video, I was struck most by their similarities. They were both hugely controversial, challenging cultural norms of how an artist should behave. They shared an unwavering confidence in their own importance in art history. They made themselves the narrative of their art, whilst Warhol saved Marilyn's legacy, Rembrandt's self-portrait saved his. And they kind of both predicted the cultural future. I mean, Rembrandt was building his personal brand almost 400 years ago. So who do I think's the winner? Well, I have a confession to make. I kind of pulled a fast one. I compared Warhol's rarest, most famous piece with one of Rembrandt's middling ones. The fact is that Rembrandt's masterpieces have long been in national galleries. They never come up for auction, and if they did, they would go for a lot more than $200 million. And as far as the money laundering thing goes, yes, people like to comment on, and yes, that does happen, but with these pieces, they're so extraordinary, with such a fascinating narrative, they're both worth a king's ransom without money laundering. I hope you enjoyed the nature of the debate we could have using novelty and nuance and narrative. If you want me to compare to other artists, just say so in the comments. And if you like this sort of thing, follow for more. Thanks for watching.